My husband stood in our bedroom, straightening his designer tie for the charity gala, and said the words that would ultimately send him to prison. Why can't you be more like Vanessa? She's sophisticated, ambitious, successful. Look at yourself, Elena. You're just comfortable. He didn't know I had already found the burner phone. He didn't know I had seen the financial transfers. And he certainly didn't know that by morning, the luxury gala he was so excited to attend would end with him and his boss lover in handcuffs, their empire of lies collapsing under the weight of evidence I had been quietly gathering for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The master bathroom of our Westchester home smelled like expensive cologne and impending betrayal. I stood in the doorway, wearing the same cotton robe I had owned for 5 years, watching my husband Marcus admire himself in the mirror. He looked impeccable in his custom-tailored tuxedo, the kind of outfit that costs more than most people spend on monthly rent. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw freshly shaved, his cufflinks glinting under the vanity lights. He looked like a man preparing for the most important night of his life, which perhaps he was, though not in the way he imagined. My name is Elena Castellano, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had built a good life. I had been married to Marcus for 12 years, raised our 2 children with devotion, maintained a home that could have graced the pages of architectural magazines, and supported my husband's career with the kind of selfless dedication that women of my generation were taught to consider noble. I had sacrificed my own career as a forensic accountant to become a full-time mother when our first child was born, telling myself it was temporary, that I would return to my profession once the children were older. 12 years later, I was still waiting for the right time, still telling myself that my contributions to our family were valuable, even if they didn't appear on tax returns or professional resumes. Marcus worked as the chief financial officer at Meridian Luxury Properties, a high-end real estate development firm that catered to the ultra-wealthy seeking vacation homes, investment properties, and status symbols disguised as residences. His boss, Vanessa Whitmore, had built the company from a small boutique agency into a regional powerhouse over 15 years of ruthless business acumen and strategic networking. She was featured regularly in business publications, photographed at charity events, and quoted as an expert on luxury market trends. She was 42 years old, unmarried, and according to every profile I had ever read about her, completely devoted to her company and her success. Marcus had been working late for the past 8 months, coming home after the children were asleep and leaving before they woke up. When I expressed concern about his schedule, he explained that Meridian was in the middle of their largest development project to date, a $200 million resort community in the Hamptons that required constant oversight and management. I had no reason to doubt him. Marcus had always been ambitious, always driven, always focused on climbing higher and earning more. That drive was part of what had attracted me to him when we met in graduate school, where he was pursuing his MBA while I completed my master's in accounting. We had seemed like the perfect partnership, 2 ambitious young people building toward a prosperous future together. But ambition, I have learned, can curdle into something darker when it becomes disconnected from integrity and loyalty. The man standing in our bathroom that evening, admiring his reflection and preparing to attend a charity gala with the woman he had been sleeping with for the past year, bore little resemblance to the partner I thought I had married. "Are you sure you don't want to come?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping I would decline. "The gala is a major networking event. Vanessa says there will be potential investors from all over the Northeast." I tightened the belt of my robe and met his eyes in the mirror. "You know I'm not comfortable at those events. I never know what to say to those people." Marcus sighed, the kind of exaggerated exhale that suggested profound disappointment barely contained by polite restraint. "That's exactly the problem, Elena. You've let yourself become so isolated, so disconnected from the professional world. Vanessa was just saying the other day how important it is for executives to have partners who can navigate social situations with grace and sophistication." The mention of Vanessa's opinion on my inadequacies sent a cold spike through my chest, though I kept my expression neutral. "Vanessa has opinions about your wife?" "She has opinions about everything," Marcus replied, adjusting his bow tie with meticulous precision. "That's what makes her successful. She understands that image matters, That perception shapes reality in business. She invests in herself, in her appearance, in her knowledge. She reads 3 newspapers every morning. She travels internationally to stay current on global market trends. She maintains relationships with influential people across multiple industries. He turned away from the mirror to face me directly, and I saw something in his expression that I had been noticing with increasing frequency over the past months. It was contempt, thinly veiled beneath a mask of concern. You used to be like that, Elena. When we met, you were sharp, ambitious, engaged with the world. Now you spend your days driving carpool, organizing playdates, and watching home renovation shows. You've let yourself become comfortable, and comfortable people don't grow. The words landed like carefully aimed strikes, each one designed to wound a different part of my self-perception. He was criticizing not just my choices but my entire existence, reducing 12 years of child-rearing, household management, and family support to a character flaw disguised as lifestyle drift. The strategy was sophisticated in its cruelty because it contained just enough truth to make me question myself. I had let my professional skills atrophy. I did spend significant time on domestic tasks that felt invisible and undervalued. I had lost touch with the ambitious young woman who once believed she could build a significant career while also maintaining a family. But what Marcus failed to acknowledge, either through genuine blindness or deliberate manipulation, was that these choices had been made jointly, negotiated through hundreds of conversations about what was best for our family. When our daughter Sophia was born, Marcus had been the one to suggest that having a parent at home would provide stability and attention that daycare could not replicate. When our son Daniel arrived 3 years later, Marcus had argued that consistency was crucial, and that returning to work while raising 2 young children would create stress that would undermine family harmony. I had agreed with these arguments not because I lacked ambition but because I believed we were making decisions as partners, sacrificing individual career advancement for collective family well-being. Now, standing in our bathroom while he prepared to attend a glamorous event with his boss and lover, Marcus was retroactively rewriting that history, transforming joint decisions into personal failures that somehow justified his betrayal. "Why can't you be more like Vanessa?" he continued, warming to his theme now that he had begun articulating it. "She's sophisticated, ambitious, successful. She takes care of herself. She invests in her appearance. She reads, she travels, she grows. Look at yourself, Elena. You're just comfortable." The final word hung in the air like an accusation. Comfortable. As if comfort were a moral failing rather than a reasonable human desire. As if the comfort I had built through years of effort somehow disqualified me from respect or loyalty. I could have responded in multiple ways to this attack. I could have defended myself, pointing out the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept our household functioning and our children thriving. I could have counterattacked, asking why my worth as a person and partner should be measured against his boss's professional achievements. I could have broken down emotionally, allowing the cruelty of his comparison to shatter the last remnants of my self-confidence. Instead, I did none of these things. Because 6 weeks earlier, I had discovered the burner phone hidden in Marcus's gym bag. And in the past 6 weeks, I had been conducting an investigation that would have made my forensic accounting professors proud. "You're right," I said quietly, maintaining eye contact. "I have become comfortable. Maybe too comfortable." Marcus seemed surprised by my agreement, his expression shifting from defensive superiority to cautious satisfaction. "I'm glad you can acknowledge that, Elena. Recognition is the first step toward change. Maybe after this gala, after the Hamptons project closes, we can talk about ways you might reinvest in yourself. Personal development, maybe some courses, a makeover consultation." He said it kindly, as if he were offering generous support rather than suggesting that I required fundamental renovation to deserve his continued affection. The condescension was breathtaking in its casual confidence. "That sounds nice," I replied, my voice carefully modulated to suggest grateful acceptance. "You should go. You don't want to be late." Marcus smiled, the expression warming his features in a way that reminded me painfully of the man I had fallen in love with 15 years ago. He crossed the bathroom and kissed my forehead with the kind of absent affection one might show a loyal dog. "Don't wait up. These events always run late, and I'll probably need to stay for after-event drinks with potential investors." "After-event drinks?" The euphemism was almost admirably brazen. I wondered if he had always been this transparently dishonest, or if his contempt for my intelligence had grown so profound that he no longer bothered with sophisticated lies. "Of course," I said. "Have a wonderful time." I followed him downstairs, watching as he collected his car keys and wallet from the entry table. Our home was beautiful in the calculated way of professionally designed spaces. All neutral colors and carefully curated artwork. A showplace that proclaimed success without revealing anything authentic about the people who lived within it. Marcus had insisted on hiring an interior designer 3 years ago, arguing that our home should reflect his professional status. I had agreed, not realizing that he was already beginning to see me as another piece of decor that required updating to match his evolving image requirements. He left without looking back, the door closing with a solid click that seemed to seal something final between us. I stood in the foyer for several minutes, listening to the silence of the house. Our children were sleeping peacefully upstairs, blissfully unaware that their family was balanced on the edge of dissolution. Sophia, now 11, had inherited my dark hair and serious demeanor. Daniel, 8 years old, had his father's charm and easy confidence. They deserved better than what was coming, but I could not protect them by enabling their father's betrayal and allowing corruption to continue unchallenged. I climbed the stairs to my home office, a converted bedroom that Marcus had grudgingly allowed me to claim when I mentioned possibly doing some freelance bookkeeping to stay current with accounting software. He had supported the idea in theory while subtly discouraging it in practice, commenting that any income one might generate would barely cover childcare costs, and suggesting that my time was better invested in family management. I had let the freelance work slide, but I had kept the office, and in the past 6 weeks it had become the command center for an investigation that would either vindicate my suspicions or prove me paranoid. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The burner phone sat in my desk drawer, exactly where I had placed it after discovering it in Marcus's gym bag. I had not confronted him immediately because years of forensic accounting work had taught me that premature accusations allow guilty parties to destroy evidence and construct defensive narratives. Instead, I had carefully documented its existence through photographs, noted the phone number, and begun the painstaking process of reconstructing Marcus's hidden activities. The phone itself had been disappointingly secured with a password I could not crack, but Marcus had made a critical error in choosing a device that automatically backed up to a cloud account. After 3 days of trying various password combinations based on meaningful dates, locations, and names, I had successfully accessed the cloud backup using a password that combined Vanessa's birthday with the street address of Meridian's corporate office. The symbolism would have been almost touching if it were not so pathetically predictable. The text message history revealed a relationship that had begun approximately 14 months earlier, initially maintaining professional boundaries before gradually shifting into personal territory, and eventually becoming explicitly romantic and sexual. The progression was documented in thousands of messages that ranged from business discussions to intimate confessions to logistical planning for their secret encounters. What had struck me most forcefully while reading these messages was not the sexual content, though that was painful enough, but rather the casual cruelty with which Marcus and Vanessa discussed me. I was referred to as the obstacle, the complication, and in one particularly cutting exchange, the anchor dragging down his potential. They discussed me as a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving consideration, strategizing about how to gradually marginalize me until divorce became inevitable and socially justifiable. But the text messages were merely the foundation of something larger and more sinister. As I continued investigating, following digital breadcrumbs with the methodical thoroughness of my professional training, I discovered that Marcus and Vanessa's relationship was not simply an affair. It was the personal dimension of a professional conspiracy that involved fraud, embezzlement, and systematic theft from Meridian Luxury Properties and its clients. The Hamptons development project that Marcus had described as requiring his constant attention was indeed real, but it was also the vehicle for a sophisticated financial scheme. Vanessa and Marcus had been inflating construction costs, creating fictitious vendor relationships, and siphoning millions of dollars into offshore accounts structured through shell companies that obscured beneficial ownership. They had been preparing for this theft for over a year, building the infrastructure that would allow them to disappear with their stolen fortune, while leaving Meridian's investors and legitimate employees to deal with the catastrophic aftermath. The charity gala that Marcus was attending tonight was not merely a networking event. It was Vanessa's farewell performance, a final public appearance before she and Marcus planned to trigger the collapse of the Hamptons project, claim business failure, and disappear to begin their new life together with money stolen from dozens of wealthy investors who had trusted Meridian's reputation and Vanessa's carefully constructed image. I had documentation of everything: bank transfers that I had traced through multiple jurisdictions, email correspondence discussing fictitious construction delays, vendor invoices for companies that existed only on paper, contract modifications that inflated costs while providing kickbacks to Marcus and Vanessa, financial projections that bore no relationship to actual development expenses. I had built a case that would satisfy both civil litigation and criminal prosecution, organizing evidence with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made me a valued forensic accountant, before I sacrificed that career for family obligations that were now revealed as a trap disguised as partnership. The question I had wrestled with over the past weeks was not whether I had sufficient evidence but rather what I should do with that evidence. The obvious path was to approach law enforcement, present my findings, and allow the criminal justice system to pursue prosecution. But that path felt insufficient given the magnitude of betrayal involved. Marcus had not simply been unfaithful. He had weaponized my trust, my domestic contributions, and my professional hiatus to build a criminal conspiracy, while systematically undermining my self-worth to justify his actions. I wanted justice, but I also wanted recognition. I wanted Marcus and Vanessa to understand that the comfortable wife they had dismissed as intellectually dormant had been the architect of their downfall. I wanted them to face consequences in a context that would maximize their humiliation, while providing the dramatic revelation that their contempt had been catastrophically misplaced. The charity gala, I realized, provided the perfect venue for this revelation. Vanessa had planned it as her triumph, a glamorous celebration attended by wealthy investors, business leaders, and social elite who validated her success and status. She and Marcus would attend as the embodied promise of Meridian's future, accepting congratulations and admiration, while privately preparing to betray everyone in attendance. The irony of transforming their moment of triumph into their moment of exposure held an aesthetic satisfaction that appealed to my sense of narrative justice. I had spent the past week coordinating with federal investigators, securities regulators, and local law enforcement to ensure that when Marcus and Vanessa were confronted, they would face immediate arrest rather than merely civil liability. The authorities had been skeptical initially, questioning whether a suburban housewife could have assembled legitimate evidence of sophisticated financial crimes. I had overcome that skepticism through the simple expedient of being more thoroughly prepared than they expected, providing documentation that demonstrated both the crimes and my competence in identifying them. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Federal agents would attend the gala disguised as guests, waiting for my signal to approach and make arrests. I would attend as well, despite Marcus's assumption that I would remain home in my comfortable irrelevance. I would wait until Vanessa gave her keynote speech, the moment she had been anticipating for months as her public validation and symbolic farewell. And then I would rise from my seat, approach the stage, and provide the evidence that would transform celebration into catastrophe. As I sat in my home office, reviewing my documentation one final time, I felt no satisfaction or anticipation. I felt only the profound sadness of recognizing that the life I had built was constructed on foundations of sand, maintained through my willingness to believe in partnership that had never truly existed. Marcus had not changed over the past year. He had simply stopped pretending to be someone he never was, revealing the selfishness and cruelty that had always lived beneath his charming exterior. But sadness, I had learned, could coexist with determination. I could mourn the death of my marriage while simultaneously refusing to accept the narrative that I deserved abandonment, because I had failed to maintain the image of sophisticated ambition that Marcus now claimed to value. I could acknowledge my own contributions to our problems, the ways I had perhaps subordinated my identity too completely to domestic roles, while still insisting that those choices did not justify betrayal, theft, and systematic emotional abuse. I looked at the clock. The gala would begin in 2 hours. Marcus and Vanessa would arrive separately to maintain the fiction of professional propriety, though everyone who mattered already knew or suspected their relationship. They would spend the evening networking, accepting praise, and privately celebrating their impending escape. And then, just as Vanessa reached the apex of her performance, I would arrive to deliver the truth that would destroy everything they had built through lies. I opened my closet and selected a dress I had purchased years ago for a different gala. One of the last professional events I had attended before Sophia's birth pulled me permanently into domestic orbit. The dress was elegant without being ostentatious, a deep navy that complemented my complexion and suggested serious purpose. I would not try to compete with Vanessa's calculated glamour. I would simply present myself as competent, credible, and utterly certain of the truth I carried. As I dressed, applying makeup with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw something I had not seen in years. I saw the woman I had been before I learned to minimize myself to accommodate someone else's ego. I saw intelligence, competence, and moral clarity that had survived years of subtle erosion. Marcus had asked why I could not be more like Vanessa, sophisticated and ambitious and successful. What he failed to understand, what his contempt had blinded him to seeing, was that I had always possessed those qualities. I had simply chosen to deploy them in service of family rather than personal advancement, a choice I had made in good faith based on promises of partnership that were revealed as lies. Tonight, Marcus and Vanessa would discover that comfortable people do indeed grow. They grow quietly, strategically, and with the patience that comes from valuing truth over immediate gratification. And when they finally reveal themselves, the harvest is all the more devastating for having been so long delayed. I collected my evidence files, my identification, and the documentation that federal agents would need to complete their case. I kissed my sleeping children, whispering apologies for the disruption that was coming while promising that what emerged from the wreckage would be built on honesty, rather than beautiful lies. And then I drove toward the luxury hotel where the gala was being held, toward the confrontation that would either vindicate everything I had sacrificed or prove me a fool for believing that truth possessed power sufficient to overcome wealth, status, and carefully constructed social narratives. The night air was cold and clear, the kind of perfect autumn evening that makes you believe the world is fundamentally ordered and just. I knew better than to trust such appearances, but as I drove through darkened streets toward my reckoning, I allowed myself to hope that justice might occasionally align with truth, and that comfort, the real comfort that comes from living with integrity, might prove more valuable than the sophisticated corruption that Marcus and Vanessa had mistaken for success. Retry JB. Proceed with Part 2. Make sure each part is at least 2,500 to 3,000 words. Make sure the story's unique and original throughout the whole entirety of the story, and don't repeat any stuff. Make sure it's more motivational. Separate each part into another window. Also remove engagement break. Edit Part 2. The Gala of Beautiful Lies. The Ashford Grand Hotel rose from the Manhattan skyline like a monument to wealth and aspiration, its Art Deco facade illuminated by precisely positioned spotlights that transformed limestone into something almost ethereal. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, depositing guests in evening wear that represented more money than most families earned in a year. Valets moved with practiced efficiency, whisking away Bentleys and Maseratis and Mercedes, while doormen in crisp uniforms guided arrivals toward the grand ballroom where Meridian Luxury Properties had orchestrated an evening designed to celebrate success while concealing theft. I arrived alone in my 10-year-old sedan, a vehicle that looked conspicuously modest among the automotive excess surrounding me. The valet accepted my keys with professional neutrality that suggested he had learned not to judge guests by their transportation choices, though I caught the flicker of surprise when I handed him a $20 bill and asked him to keep the car readily accessible. He nodded and provided a claim ticket, perhaps sensing that my evening might not follow the standard trajectory of cocktails, dinner, speeches, and leisurely departure in the small hours of morning. The hotel lobby gleamed with polished marble and crystal chandeliers, a space designed to make visitors feel simultaneously welcomed and intimidated by the grandeur surrounding them. Elegantly dressed people moved through the space in clusters, their conversations punctuated by laughter that carried the particular tone of individuals comfortable with their place in hierarchies of wealth and influence. I recognized several faces from business publications and society pages, the kind of people who existed in a world parallel to but fundamentally separate from the life I had been living for the past 12 years. I had timed my arrival deliberately, choosing to enter after the cocktail reception had begun but before dinner service would confine guests to assigned seating. This timing would allow me to observe without being immediately noticed, to assess the social dynamics and confirm the presence of the federal agents who had coordinated with me over the past week. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had assured me that her team would blend seamlessly into the crowd, but I needed visual confirmation before proceeding with a plan that required precise coordination and timing. The grand ballroom occupied the entire second floor of the hotel, accessible via a sweeping staircase that encouraged dramatic entrances. I climbed slowly, using the ascent to steady my breathing and reinforce my resolve. Doubt whispered seductively, suggesting that I was about to destroy my life over suspicions that might be overblown, that Marcus might deserve a chance to explain himself before I triggered consequences that could never be reversed. But I had learned through years of forensic accounting work that doubt serves truth when it demands rigorous evidence and serves deception when it paralyzes action despite overwhelming proof. I had proof. What I needed now was courage to act on it. The ballroom was spectacular in its calculated opulence. Round tables dressed in ivory linen surrounded a central dance floor, each table set with crystal glassware and silver flatware that caught and refracted light from enormous chandeliers overhead. A string quartet played in one corner, their classical repertoire providing sophisticated background ambience. Floor-to-ceiling windows along the far wall offered views of the Manhattan skyline, the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars. At the front of the room, a raised stage held a podium adorned with Meridian's logo, flanked by enormous screens that would display presentation materials during the evening's speeches. Approximately 200 guests circulated through the space, clustering around high-top tables positioned throughout the room's perimeter where servers offered champagne and elaborately constructed hors d'oeuvres. The dress code was black tie formal, and the attendees had responded with enthusiasm, the women in designer gowns and statement jewelry, the men in custom tuxedos that fit like second skins. I felt conspicuously understated in my navy dress, though I reminded myself that my objective was not to compete socially but to establish credibility as someone serious and substantive rather than merely decorative. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, using it as a social prop while I scanned the room for familiar faces. I spotted Marcus almost immediately, standing near the bar in a cluster of men who appeared to be engaged in the kind of business conversation that men conduct at social events, discussing deals and market conditions while their wives or partners networked separately. Marcus looked relaxed and confident, laughing at something one of his companions had said, completely at ease in this environment where he felt he belonged. Vanessa Whitmore held court near the stage, surrounded by a larger group that included several women I recognized from business publications as prominent investors and philanthropists. Vanessa was stunning in a way that suggested extensive professional assistance, her emerald gown perfectly tailored to her slender frame, her blonde hair arranged in an elegant updo that emphasized her striking bone structure. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, substantial pieces that declared both taste and resources. She gestured expressively as she spoke, commanding attention with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. I studied her with clinical detachment, trying to understand what had attracted Marcus beyond the obvious physical appeal. Vanessa projected power and certainty, an aura of success that promised elevation to anyone associated with her. She represented everything Marcus aspired to become, a vision of achievement uncomplicated by domestic obligations or emotional depth. Their affair was not simply about sexual attraction. It was about Marcus's desire to transform himself into someone worthy of existing in Vanessa's orbit, to shed the comfortable suburban life we had built together like an outgrown skin that no longer fit his evolving self-image. The irony was almost painful in its obviousness. Marcus had criticized me for becoming comfortable, for losing the ambitious edge I possessed when we met. But his attraction to Vanessa revealed that he valued not genuine partnership but rather reflected glory, the status that came from association with someone whose success validated his own worth. He had not wanted a wife who challenged him to grow. He had wanted an accessory that proclaimed his arrival in social strata. He had always coveted from outside. I moved along the room's perimeter, staying away from the central gathering areas while searching for the federal agents who should be present. Special Agent Torres had described her team's appearance in general terms without providing specific identifying information, explaining that operational security required maintaining cover, until the moment of arrest. I would need to trust that they were present and prepared even without visual confirmation. Though trust had become a commodity I distributed sparingly after discovering how completely my husband had betrayed the faith I placed in him. A voice behind me spoke with warmth that suggested recognition. Elena? Elena Castellano? I hardly recognized you. I turned to find Catherine Murdoch, a woman I had known slightly during my forensic accounting career. Catherine worked for one of the major investment firms that had committed capital to Meridian's Hamptons development project, and I remembered her as sharp, ethical, and intolerant of the casual corruption that infected too much of the financial industry. We had worked together on one audit approximately 15 years ago, a collaboration brief enough that I was surprised she remembered me at all. Catherine, I replied, accepting her offered hand. It has been a long time. At least a decade, Catherine agreed, her smile genuine despite the passage of years. I heard you stepped away from accounting to focus on family. How have you been? Are you working again? The question contained no judgment, merely curiosity, but it still landed awkwardly. I had rehearsed various cover stories for why I was attending the gala, but Catherine's direct recognition eliminated the possibility of pretending to be someone other than Marcus Chen's wife, the woman whose husband worked as Meridian's chief financial officer. I have been considering returning to forensic work, I said carefully. Actually, that is partly why I am here tonight. I wanted to observe Meridian's operations and better understand the company where my husband has invested so much time and energy over the past year. Catherine's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something that might have been concern or perhaps merely thoughtfulness crossing her features. Meridian is certainly ambitious. The Hamptons project is one of the largest residential developments in the region. My firm has significant capital at risk. She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. Though I will admit the financial reporting has been somewhat opaque lately. Normal construction delays and cost overruns, according to your husband and Ms. Whitmore, but our risk assessment team has been asking for more detailed documentation. My pulse quickened. Catherine's comment suggested that investor concerns had already begun surfacing, that Marcus and Vanessa's fraud might be approaching exposure even without my intervention. But institutional investors move slowly, their skepticism tempered by desire to avoid embarrassment over poor due diligence. Without definitive proof of wrongdoing, they would likely continue accepting explanations and delays while hemorrhaging money into a project designed to enrich the very people they trusted to manage their capital responsibly. Have you received the documentation you requested? I asked, keeping my tone casual despite the importance of her answer. Catherine shook her head slightly. We have received reports certainly, but they lack the granularity we typically expect for a project of this scale and complexity. Every inquiry generates plausible explanations, but something feels off. I cannot articulate exactly what troubles me, but 30 years in this industry teaches you to trust your instincts when numbers do not quite align with narratives. Her instincts were correct, though I could not explain that to her yet. Instead, I simply said, "Perhaps your concerns will be addressed soon." Sometimes clarity comes from unexpected directions. Catherine studied me with increased attention, her analytical mind clearly registering something in my tone or expression that suggested layers beneath casual conversation. Elena, is there something I should know? If you have information about irregularities at Meridian, my firm would be extremely interested in hearing about them. I was saved from answering by the sound of a gentle chime that signaled guests should begin moving toward their assigned tables for dinner service. Catherine touched my arm lightly and said, "We should continue this conversation. Here is my card. Call me anytime, truly." I accepted the card and watched her move toward her table, part of me wishing I could simply hand over my evidence to responsible investors like Catherine and allow them to handle the exposure of Marcus and Vanessa's crimes through conventional channels. But that path would deny me the confrontation I needed, the moment where I could demonstrate to Marcus and Vanessa and myself that comfortable women possess power they consistently underestimate until that power destroys them. I located my own table, positioned strategically in a section reserved for Meridian employees and their spouses. I had secured an invitation through a carefully worded request to Meridian's event coordinator, explaining that I hoped to surprise Marcus by attending despite my earlier declination. The coordinator had been happy to accommodate, never imagining that my surprise would extend far beyond simple appearance at an event. Marcus had not yet noticed my presence, still engaged in conversation near the bar. Vanessa circulated through the room, greeting important guests and accepting congratulations on Meridian's success. She moved with practiced grace, touching arms and leaning in for air kisses and laughing at appropriate moments, a performance so polished it appeared almost choreographed. This was her element, the public validation she craved and had stolen from others to achieve. I took my seat at the table, positioning myself to have clear sight lines to both the stage where Vanessa would eventually speak and the entrance where federal agents would eventually arrive to make arrests. My tablemates were other Meridian employees, junior associates whose names I vaguely recognized from Marcus's occasional mentions of office dynamics. They greeted me with polite surprise, clearly not expecting the chief financial officer's wife to attend without her husband's escort. "Elena, what a lovely surprise," said Amanda Brooks, a marketing coordinator I had met briefly at a previous company function. "We did not realize you would be joining us tonight." "Last-minute decision," I replied with a smile that I hoped appeared natural despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "I decided Marcus has been working so hard on the Hamptons project that I should at least see the celebration of all that effort." The comment prompted enthusiastic agreement from others at the table, all of whom seemed genuinely impressed by the long hours and dedication that Marcus had devoted to Meridian over the past year. None of them knew, of course, that those long hours had been spent constructing elaborate fraud rather than legitimately developing real estate. They saw only the surface performance of dedication while remaining blind to the corruption underneath. Dinner service began with servers delivering first courses with choreographed precision. The meal was elaborate, each course more artfully presented than the last, a gastronomic celebration that probably cost more per plate than a week of groceries for an average family. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, my attention divided between watching Marcus and Vanessa and monitoring the room for signs of the law enforcement presence that should be materializing. Marcus finally noticed me midway through the second course. I saw the exact moment recognition hit, his expression transitioning from casual contentment to shocked disbelief to barely concealed anger in the span of seconds. He excused himself from his conversation and began making his way toward my table, his body language radiating tension despite his attempt to maintain composure. He arrived as servers were clearing plates, leaning down to speak quietly near my ear. "What are you doing here, Elena? I thought you were staying home." "I changed my mind," I replied with deliberate calmness. "You said this was an important networking event. I decided I should support you." Marcus's jaw tightened. "This is not appropriate. We discussed this. You said you were not comfortable at these events." "I said many things," I responded, meeting his eyes steadily. "Perhaps I am trying to become more like Vanessa, sophisticated, ambitious, engaged with the professional world rather than hiding at home in comfortable isolation." The words were his own, thrown back with enough edge that he could not miss the implicit challenge. Marcus straightened, his expression hardening. "We will discuss this later. I need to get back to my table before the speeches begin." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "I look forward to hearing Vanessa speak. I have heard she is quite inspiring." Marcus walked away without responding, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the subtle disruption to his earlier confidence. My presence had unsettled him, introduced an unpredictable variable into an evening he believed he controlled completely. Good. Uncertainty was the beginning of vulnerability, and vulnerability created openings that could be exploited. The meal continued through several more courses while I made polite conversation with my tablemates and watched the room's dynamics shift as dinner transitioned toward the evening's formal program. Servers cleared the final plates and refilled wine glasses while the string quartet concluded their performance. The room's lighting dimmed slightly, focusing attention toward the stage where Meridian's chief operating officer approached the podium to begin the speeches. The chief operating officer delivered brief welcoming remarks, thanking guests for their attendance and support of Meridian's growth and charitable initiatives. He introduced several major investors who had contributed to the Hamptons project, prompting polite applause. He acknowledged Meridian's employees for their dedication and hard work. And then he introduced Vanessa Whitmore, describing her in terms so laudatory they bordered on hagiography, as a visionary leader who had built Meridian into a premier luxury real estate firm through innovation, integrity, and unwavering commitment to excellence. Vanessa ascended the stage to enthusiastic applause, the spotlight illuminating her emerald gown and diamond jewelry in a way that made her appear almost luminous. She smiled with practiced warmth, allowing the applause to continue for several seconds before raising her hand to quiet the crowd. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the ballroom's sound system, confident and commanding. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Vanessa began. 14 years ago, I founded Meridian Luxury Properties with a simple vision: to create not just buildings, but communities where people could live their best lives surrounded by beauty, comfort, and sophistication. That vision has guided everything we have built, every decision we have made, every relationship we have cultivated. She clicked a remote and the screens flanking the podium displayed a montage of Meridian's completed projects, stunning properties photographed in golden hour light that made them appear like architectural fantasies rather than actual structures. The images transitioned smoothly, accompanied by subtle background music that enhanced the emotional resonance. "Our success has been built on trust," Vanessa continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Our clients trust us to deliver on our promises. Our investors trust us to manage their capital responsibly. Our employees trust us to provide leadership and direction. That trust is sacred to me, something I work every day to honor and preserve." The hypocrisy was staggering. Vanessa stood before a room full of people she was actively betraying, delivering speeches about trust while planning to disappear with millions of dollars stolen through systematic fraud. The audacity would have been impressive if it were not so morally repugnant. "The Hamptons project represents our most ambitious undertaking to date," Vanessa said as the screens displayed architectural renderings of the proposed development. $200 million invested in creating a coastal community that will set new standards for luxury residential living. "We are not simply building houses. We are creating a lifestyle, a statement about what is possible when vision meets execution." She paused for effect, her gaze sweeping across the audience with theatrical precision. "And I am pleased to announce tonight that we have reached a critical milestone. Construction is ahead of schedule. Pre-sales have exceeded our most optimistic projections. We are on track to deliver this extraordinary community to our clients within 18 months, with returns that will reward our investors' faith in Meridian's capabilities." The announcement prompted enthusiastic applause from guests, who believed they were celebrating genuine achievement, rather than witnessing the final act of an elaborate deception. I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, watching Vanessa accept congratulations that she had obtained through theft and lies. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Vanessa had reached the apex of her performance, basking in admiration from people she had manipulated and betrayed. The fall from this height would be all the more devastating for the distance traveled, the public humiliation all the more complete for the witnesses present to observe her exposure. I stood slowly, my movement drawing attention from nearby tables as I began walking toward the stage. Vanessa noticed immediately, her expression flickering with confusion as she recognized me despite the years since we had last encountered each other at some forgettable company function. I saw Marcus rise from his table, his face pale with dawning horror as he realized I was not simply attending the gala as a passive observer but intended to actively participate in some way he could not yet comprehend. I reached the stage and climbed the stairs with deliberate care, my heels clicking against wood in the suddenly quiet ballroom. Vanessa watched my approach with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, her professional composure maintained despite obvious uncertainty about my intentions. "Elena," she said warmly, though I detected the steel beneath her pleasant tone. "What a surprise to see you here tonight. Did you want to say something?" I accepted the microphone she offered with a hand that remained perfectly steady despite my racing heart. I turned to face the audience. 200 people in evening wear staring at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion to barely concealed annoyance at this disruption to their carefully orchestrated evening. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice amplified through the ballroom's sound system. "I do indeed have something to say. My name is Elena Castellano-Chun. Some of you may recognize me as Marcus Chen's wife, though that is not the most important aspect of my identity tonight. What matters more is my professional background as a forensic accountant specializing in financial fraud detection and investigation." The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably, confusion giving way to tension as guests sensed that something significant and unpleasant was about to unfold. Vanessa's smile froze into something rigid and artificial. Marcus had gone completely still at his table, a trapped animal calculating impossible escape routes. Over the past 6 weeks, I continued, I have been conducting an investigation into the financial management of Meridian Luxury Properties Hamptons development project. What I discovered is systematic fraud involving inflated construction costs, fictitious vendor relationships, and the diversion of investor capital into offshore accounts controlled by Ms. Whitmore and my husband through shell companies designed to obscure beneficial ownership. Gasps rippled through the audience. Vanessa's face had gone ashen beneath her carefully applied makeup. Several guests pulled out phones, perhaps to verify whether this dramatic accusation could possibly be legitimate, or merely the unhinged ravings of a disturbed woman seeking attention. I have documentation of everything, I said clearly. Bank transfers traced through multiple jurisdictions. Email correspondence discussing fictitious construction delays created to justify cost overruns. Vendor invoices for companies that exist only on paper. Contract modifications that inflated legitimate expenses while providing kickbacks to Ms. Whitmore and Mr. Chun. Financial projections that bear no relationship to actual development costs. I have organized this evidence and provided it to federal investigators, securities regulators, and local law enforcement. I turned to look directly at Vanessa, meeting her eyes with a gaze that communicated everything I had learned about her through months of investigation. You spoke eloquently about trust being sacred, about honoring the faith that clients and investors place in Meridian. But trust is not merely words delivered from stages at luxury galas. Trust is demonstrated through actions, through integrity maintained even when deception would be profitable. You have betrayed every person in this room who believed in you, who invested their money based on your reputation, who recommended Meridian to friends and colleagues because they trusted your competence and ethics. Vanessa found her voice, though it emerged shakier than the confident tone she had used moments earlier during her speech. This is absurd. Elena, I understand you are going through some personal difficulties in your marriage, but making wild accusations at a public event is not an appropriate way to address private grievances. The deflection was predictable, an attempt to reframe my carefully documented accusations as emotional instability rather than factual revelation. But I had anticipated this defense and prepared accordingly. Personal difficulties, I repeated. An interesting characterization for discovering that my husband has been conducting an affair with his boss, while conspiring to steal millions of dollars from investors. But let us set aside the personal dimension and focus purely on the financial evidence. I invite anyone in this room to review the documentation I have provided to authorities. You will find that every claim I have made is supported by concrete evidence including banking records, corporate filings, email correspondence, and forensic analysis of Meridian's financial statements. I turned back to the audience, raising my voice slightly to ensure everyone heard clearly. Ms. Whitmore suggested I am motivated by personal grievance, and she is correct that I have been personally betrayed. But I am here tonight not as a wronged wife seeking revenge. I am here as a forensic accountant who uncovered systematic fraud and felt morally obligated to ensure that truth was revealed publicly before more people were victimized by this scheme. The fact that my husband was complicit in this fraud makes the revelation more painful, but it does not make it less necessary. Movement at the ballroom's entrance caught my attention. Special Agent Rebecca Torres entered accompanied by 4 other individuals whose body language and purposeful movement identified them as law enforcement despite their formal evening wear. They approached the stage with expressions of professional neutrality that suggested they had witnessed many dramatic confrontations and would not be swayed by emotional appeals or social status. Vanessa saw them approaching and understood immediately what their presence meant. Her composure finally shattered completely, her face transforming from confident corporate leader to cornered criminal in the span of heartbeats. She looked toward Marcus, perhaps hoping for support or escape strategy, but he remained frozen at his table, trapped by witnesses on all sides and finally understanding that his carefully constructed deception had collapsed irreversibly. Special Agent Torres climbed the stage and approached Vanessa with credentials extended. Ms. Whitmore, I am Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The Miranda warnings continued as additional agents approached Marcus at his table, producing handcuffs and reading him his rights while the assembled guests watched in stunned silence. The elegant charity gala had transformed into a crime scene, the evening's celebration of success revealed as the final act of a criminal conspiracy. I descended from the stage and handed the microphone back to Meridian's chief operating officer, who stood near the podium looking completely overwhelmed by the rapid destruction of everything he thought he understood about his company and its leadership. I walked toward the exit, my role in the evening's drama complete, my purpose fulfilled through the simple act of refusing to remain silent, while corruption masqueraded as achievement. Catherine Murdoch intercepted me near the ballroom doors. "Elena, what you just did took extraordinary courage. My firm will want to depose you as part of our civil recovery efforts. Would you be willing to testify?" "Yes," I replied simply. "I will testify as many times as necessary to ensure that everyone victimized by this fraud receives whatever justice and restitution is possible." As I walked through the hotel lobby toward the valet stand where my modest sedan waited, I heard sirens approaching outside. More law enforcement arriving to secure the scene and transport Marcus and Vanessa to federal detention. The luxury gala had indeed ended in prison, just as I had promised in those opening moments when I disrupted Vanessa's triumphant speech with truth she could not deflect or deny. I drove home through streets that felt different somehow, as if exposing betrayal had shifted my relationship with the physical world around me. The journey was complete in one sense but only beginning in another. Marcus and Vanessa would face criminal prosecution that would consume years and probably result in substantial prison sentences. I would face divorce proceedings, financial uncertainty, and the challenge of explaining to my children why their father would be absent from their lives. The comfortable life I had built was destroyed, but what replaced it would at least have the virtue of being honest. The days following my decision to attend the gala were consumed by a different kind of preparation than I had undertaken during the investigation phase. Gathering evidence required patience, analytical skill, and methodical attention to detail. Acting on that evidence demanded something far more difficult: the courage to irrevocably destroy the life I had known while accepting that what emerged from the wreckage remained uncertain and potentially devastating. I spent those final days before the confrontation organizing my documentation into formats that would serve multiple audiences and purposes. Federal investigators required one type of presentation, emphasizing criminal violations and jurisdictional authority. Securities regulators needed different emphasis, focusing on investor protection and market manipulation. Civil attorneys representing defrauded investors would want yet another approach, highlighting damages and causation chains that supported financial recovery. Each audience brought different expertise, different priorities, and different standards of proof that my evidence needed to satisfy simultaneously. The work was exhausting in ways that transcended physical fatigue. I functioned on minimal sleep, rising before dawn to continue organizing files and preparing summaries while Marcus slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his wife was constructing the framework for his destruction. The cognitive dissonance of maintaining normal domestic routines, while simultaneously building a criminal case against my husband, created psychological strain that manifested in physical symptoms. My hands developed a tremor that appeared during moments of stress. My appetite disappeared almost completely, food tasting like ash regardless of its actual quality. I lost 8 pounds in 3 weeks, my clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had always been slender but now appeared almost gaunt. Sophia noticed the changes before Marcus did, approaching me one evening while I worked in my home office with an expression of concern that broke my heart with its premature maturity. She was 11 years old, balanced on the edge between childhood and adolescence, old enough to perceive that something significant was troubling her mother, but young enough to lack the conceptual framework for understanding adult betrayal and its consequences. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked quietly, hovering in the doorway as if uncertain whether her presence would be welcomed or represent an unwanted intrusion into adult matters she sensed but could not name. I closed my laptop and turned to face her fully, recognizing that this moment represented one of countless small tragedies that would accompany the larger cataclysm I was preparing to unleash. Sophia deserved a mother who was present and attentive rather than consumed by rage and sorrow disguised as methodical investigation. She deserved a family that remained intact, rather than splintering into fragments that could never be reassembled into their original configuration. But I could not provide those things while also refusing to enable the corruption that had infected our lives like a cancer metastasizing silently until it threatened to destroy everything healthy and genuine. I am managing some complicated adult problems right now, I told her honestly, patting the chair beside my desk in invitation. Nothing for you to worry about. But I know I have been distracted lately. I am sorry for that. Sophia settled into the chair with the careful deliberation she brought to most physical actions, a tendency toward thoughtfulness that suggested she would grow into someone who considered consequences before acting. Is it about Dad? He has been weird lately too. Like he is here but not really here, you know? The observation was astute and painful in equal measure. Marcus had indeed been increasingly absent even when physically present. His attention focused on the dual demands of maintaining his fraud and conducting his affair with Vanessa. Family dinners had become performances where he went through motions of engagement, while his mind occupied itself with calculations about offshore accounts and exit strategies. He asked about homework and extracurricular activities with the distracted courtesy of someone fulfilling obligations rather than expressing genuine interest. Your father has been very busy with an important work project, I said, offering the same explanation Marcus had been using for months to justify his absences and distraction. The irony of perpetuating his lies even as I worked to expose them was not lost on me, but I could not explain the truth to Sophia before I had confronted Marcus himself. She would learn soon enough that her father was a criminal and an adulterer, that the comfortable life she had known was built on foundations of fraud and deception. For now, I could still protect her from that knowledge for a few more days. When his project is finished, will things go back to normal? Sophia asked with the hopefulness of a child who still believed that adult problems could be resolved through sufficient effort and good intentions. I pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly while fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. Things will change, I said carefully, choosing words that were honest without being cruel. But I promise that you and Daniel will always be loved and cared for, no matter what changes happen in other parts of our lives. Sophia accepted this vague reassurance with the resilience of children, who learn early to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. She hugged me back and then returned to her room to complete homework assignments, leaving me alone with my documentation and the hollow ache of knowing that I was about to inflict trauma on my children in service of principles they were too young to fully understand or appreciate. Marcus remained oblivious to the approaching reckoning, his confidence in his own cleverness preventing him from recognizing the signs that should have alerted him to danger. He continued his late nights and weekend absences, offering explanations about construction deadlines and investor meetings that I accepted with the same passive acquiescence I had demonstrated for months. He never questioned why I had stopped asking detailed questions about his schedule or expressing concern about the strain his work was placing on our family. He interpreted my silence as resignation rather than strategic preparation, another example of how thoroughly his contempt had blinded him to my actual capabilities. The federal investigators I worked with during this period treated me with a respect that felt almost startling after years of being dismissed as merely a stay-at-home mother whose professional skills had atrophied into irrelevance. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who served as the lead investigator on the case, was a woman in her early 40s with the direct manner of someone who had learned that efficiency served justice better than excessive diplomacy. She reviewed my documentation with obvious appreciation for its thoroughness, asking sharp questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of forensic accounting principles and financial fraud mechanics. "This is exceptional work," she told me during one of our meetings at a coffee shop far enough from my neighborhood that we were unlikely to encounter anyone who might recognize me and wonder why I was having intense conversations with a woman who carried herself with unmistakable law enforcement bearing. "Most civilian complainants bring us suspicions and fragments. You are bringing us a complete prosecutable case with evidence organized exactly how we would have gathered it ourselves if we had known to investigate." The compliment landed with unexpected emotional force, validation from a professional who understood the skill and effort required to construct the case I had built. "I spent years doing this work before I left to raise my children," I explained. "I suppose the training never really leaves you, even when you stop practicing actively." Agent Torres studied me with an expression that suggested she saw past my carefully maintained professional demeanor to the grief and rage churning beneath the surface. This must be extraordinarily difficult for you personally. Investigating your own husband. Uncovering evidence that he has betrayed you in multiple ways simultaneously. Most people in your position would want to look away, to convince themselves there must be some innocent explanation despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. I considered that option, I admitted. For approximately 5 minutes after I discovered the burner phone, I thought about confronting Marcus and demanding explanations that might preserve some version of our marriage. But I knew what I would find if I investigated thoroughly. Part of me had suspected for months that something was deeply wrong, that his absences and distraction were not simply about legitimate work pressures. The evidence confirmed suspicions I had been suppressing because facing the truth required accepting that everything I had built my adult life around was fundamentally dishonest. Agent Torres nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed many similar reckonings. What you are doing requires tremendous courage. You understand that proceeding with this prosecution will make your life significantly more difficult in the short term. You will face financial uncertainty during divorce proceedings. Your husband will likely attempt to portray you as vindictive or unstable to deflect from his own criminal behavior. Some people in your social circle will take his side either because they genuinely believe him or because doing so serves their own interests. You will be subjected to scrutiny and judgment that feels profoundly unfair given that you are the victim rather than the perpetrator of wrongdoing. I understand all of that, I confirmed. But the alternative is remaining silent while Marcus and Vanessa continue stealing from investors who trusted them, eventually disappearing with millions of dollars while leaving others to absorb catastrophic financial losses. I cannot live with that knowledge while doing nothing to stop it. And I cannot model for my children that betrayal and corruption should be tolerated in exchange for material comfort and social stability. The conversation captured the essential tension that had dominated my thinking throughout the investigation. Exposing Marcus and Vanessa would trigger consequences that extended far beyond their own criminal liability. I would become a public figure associated with financial scandal, forever known as the wife who brought down her husband and his lover through meticulous evidence gathering. Some people would admire my courage and integrity. Others would view me with suspicion and discomfort, questioning my motives and wondering what kind of woman systematically builds a criminal case against her own spouse. My children would grow up with the knowledge that their father was in federal prison for fraud, a stigma that would follow them through school years and potentially into adulthood. But the alternative required accepting that comfort and stability, purchased through enabling corruption, were worth more than truth and accountability. It required teaching Sophia and Daniel through my example that loyalty to family superseded all other ethical obligations, that private grievances should be swallowed quietly rather than exposing public wrongdoing, that women should accept betrayal and abuse rather than disrupting the social order through demands for justice. I had tried that approach for most of my adult life, subordinating my own ambitions and identity to family cohesion and domestic tranquility. The result had been 12 years of gradually diminishing self-worth, culminating in my husband's contemptuous comparison of me to his mistress and criminal co-conspirator. That path led nowhere I wanted my daughter to follow. If I remained silent now, I would be demonstrating that women should accept mistreatment rather than demanding better, that maternal love meant protecting children from truth rather than teaching them to value integrity above convenience. The decision became clearer the more I examined it from different angles. I was not acting from vengeance, though anger certainly motivated my determination to see Marcus face consequences for his actions. I was acting from principle, from the belief that systematic fraud should be exposed and prosecuted regardless of the personal costs involved. That Marcus happened to be my husband made the situation more painful, but did not change the fundamental ethics involved. Agent Torres and her team prepared for the Gala arrests with the kind of meticulous planning that professional law enforcement brings to high-profile cases. They coordinated with local police to ensure adequate backup would be available if Marcus or Vanessa attempted to flee or resist arrest. They arranged for federal prosecutors to be available for initial appearance hearings that would occur within hours of the arrests. They briefed me repeatedly on what to expect during and after the confrontation, warning me about potential complications and ensuring I understood the limitations of what they could control once events began unfolding in public. The arrest itself will proceed according to standard protocols. Agent Torres explained during our final planning meeting the day before the gala. We will allow you to make your public statement exposing the fraud, giving you the opportunity to control the initial narrative before defense attorneys begin constructing alternative explanations. Once you have finished speaking and it becomes clear that we are present as law enforcement rather than ordinary guests, we will approach and execute the arrests. The process will be professional and by the book, but it will also be public and potentially dramatic given the setting and the audience present. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. You should understand that the moment we make arrests, you lose control of what happens next. Marcus and Vanessa will be transported to federal detention for processing and initial hearings. They will have opportunities to speak to media, to hire expensive defense attorneys who specialize in creating sympathetic narratives around white-collar defendants. You will be subjected to intense scrutiny as the person who triggered the investigation. Everything about your background, your marriage, your motivations will be examined and potentially weaponized by people who want to discredit your evidence or suggest that you are unreliable or vindictive. I understand, I replied, though understanding intellectually and experiencing emotionally were entirely different matters. I have accepted that once this process begins, I cannot control how other people interpret or respond to my actions. All I can control is whether I speak the truth about what I discovered and allow the justice system to proceed from there. The night before the gala I barely slept, lying awake beside Marcus while he rested peacefully, completely unaware that his comfortable life would end within 24 hours. I studied his face in the darkness, trying to reconcile the man I had loved for 15 years with the criminal and adulterer he had revealed himself to be. Were there signs I had missed earlier in our relationship that might have predicted this outcome? Had he always possessed the capacity for this level of deception, or had he transformed gradually into someone capable of systematic fraud and betrayal? I would probably never know the answers to those questions with certainty. People are complex, containing multitudes of potential selves that emerge or remain dormant depending on circumstances and choices. Perhaps Marcus had always carried this darkness within him, waiting for the right combination of opportunity and rationalization to manifest as criminal action. Perhaps he had genuinely been a better person earlier in our relationship, and had degraded over time through small compromises that accumulated into profound corruption. Either way, the man sleeping beside me was not the partner I had believed I married, and I could not continue pretending otherwise merely to preserve domestic stability. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through bedroom curtains, another autumn day that promised crisp temperatures and clear skies. Marcus woke with obvious excitement about the evening ahead, the culmination of months of planning for what he believed would be a celebration of his cleverness and imminent escape. He showered and dressed with unusual care despite the fact that he would be returning home to change into his tuxedo before the gala. He wanted to look successful and confident at the office, projecting an image of someone whose life was proceeding exactly according to plan. I made breakfast for the children and helped them prepare for school, going through familiar morning routines while my mind occupied itself with final preparations for the confrontation ahead. Sophia gave me an extra long hug before leaving for the bus, perhaps sensing through some intuitive channel that significant changes were approaching even if she could not articulate what those changes might entail. Daniel chattered happily about a science project due later in the week, oblivious to adult tensions and simply grateful that his mother was paying attention rather than being distracted by whatever had been consuming her focus lately. After the children left and Marcus departed for the office, I spent several hours reviewing my documentation one final time, checking and rechecking that everything was organized correctly, and that I had not overlooked any crucial evidence or made any errors in my analysis that defense attorneys might exploit to create reasonable doubt. The review confirmed what I already knew. The case was solid, built on documentary evidence that clearly established systematic fraud over an extended period. Marcus and Vanessa had been thorough in their theft but not thorough enough in concealing it, leaving digital traces that someone with my training and determination could follow to their inevitable conclusion. I also spent time drafting a letter to Sophia and Daniel that I would leave for them regardless of how the evening unfolded. The letter attempted to explain in age-appropriate language why their father would be facing criminal charges, and why their family was dissolving despite my earlier promises that they would always be loved and protected. Writing it was one of the most difficult tasks I had ever undertaken, searching for words that would convey truth without destroying their sense of security, that would acknowledge pain without amplifying it unnecessarily. The letter went through multiple drafts before I arrived at a version that felt honest and compassionate in appropriate measure. I sealed it in an envelope and left it on my desk with instructions to the babysitter to give it to the children in the morning if I had not returned home by the time they woke up. I hoped I would be home to explain things personally, but I needed to prepare for the possibility that events at the gala might unfold in ways that prevented my immediate return. The afternoon passed slowly, each hour feeling stretched and distorted by anticipation and anxiety. I tried to occupy myself with routine household tasks, finding temporary distraction in laundry and cleaning, but my mind kept returning to the evening ahead and all the ways the confrontation might unfold. What if federal agents were delayed or unable to attend? What if Vanessa suspected something and canceled the gala at the last minute? What if Marcus somehow discovered my investigation in the final hours before exposure and fled before he could be arrested? These worries were largely irrational, the product of stress rather than realistic assessment of probabilities, but they plagued me nonetheless. I had invested so much emotional energy and practical effort into this moment that the prospect of something going wrong felt unbearable. But I also recognized that once I set events in motion by attending the gala and publicly exposing the fraud, I would lose control of outcomes. I could only present truth as clearly and completely as possible, and then trust that institutional systems would respond appropriately. Marcus returned home in the late afternoon to shower and change into his tuxedo, his excitement palpable as he prepared for what he believed would be an evening of triumph and celebration. He stood in our bathroom once again admiring his reflection, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was preparing to destroy everything he had been building through deception and theft. The scene was almost identical to the evening when he had compared me unfavorably to Vanessa, when he had asked why I could not be more like his sophisticated and ambitious lover. That comparison had been the catalyst that transformed my investigation from abstract evidence gathering into personal mission. Marcus had revealed not just his infidelity but his complete contempt for the life we had built together. His belief that I had somehow failed as a wife and partner because I had chosen to invest in family rather than personal ambition and professional advancement. He had weaponized my choices against me, turning sacrifices I had made in good faith into character defects that justified his betrayal. Tonight I would answer his question about why I could not be more like Vanessa. I would demonstrate that comfortable women possess capabilities that arrogant men consistently underestimate, until those capabilities destroy them. I would prove that intelligence and competence do not atrophy during years of domestic focus, but merely redirect toward different applications, remaining available when circumstances demand their deployment. I watched Marcus leave the house for the final time as the husband I had known for 12 years. When he returned, it would be as a defendant facing federal prosecution, a man whose comfortable life had collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance and criminality. Part of me mourned the death of what I had believed our marriage to be, even while recognizing that I was grieving an illusion rather than reality. The partnership I thought we had built together had never actually existed. I had simply been too trusting or too willfully blind to recognize the truth until evidence forced acknowledgement. But another part of me felt something approaching liberation. For years I had minimized myself to accommodate Marcus's ego and ambitions, accepting his implicit message that my worth derived from supporting his success, rather than pursuing my own achievements. I had allowed him to define the terms of our relationship, while I adapted to meet his evolving expectations. That dynamic had been toxic and unsustainable, creating the conditions where Marcus felt entitled to betray me, because he no longer valued what I contributed to his life. Tonight I would reclaim my voice and my agency. I would demonstrate that I was not merely the comfortable wife Marcus had dismissed as irrelevant to his future plans but rather a formidable opponent whose intelligence and determination he had catastrophically underestimated. The revelation would be devastating for him and painful for our children and disruptive to the comfortable social order that preferred private betrayals remain concealed rather than exposed to public scrutiny. But it would also be true. And truth, I had come to believe, possessed value that transcended personal cost or social convenience. Exposing Marcus and Vanessa's fraud would not undo the damage they had caused or restore what had been lost. It would not heal my broken marriage or protect my children from the pain of learning that their father was a criminal, but it would establish a clear record that systematic corruption had occurred, and that someone had cared enough about accountability to ensure wrongdoing did not proceed unchallenged. As I dressed for the gala in my navy gown and applied makeup with steady hands, I thought about all the women throughout history who had faced similar decisions about whether to speak truth that would cost them dearly. Women who had exposed abuse despite knowing they would be disbelieved or blamed. Women who had challenged institutional corruption despite understanding that whistleblowers typically suffer more than the corrupt officials they expose. Women who had refused to remain complicit in injustice, even when compliance would have been safer and more comfortable. I was joining that tradition, adding my voice to the collective insistence that truth matters and that loyalty to corrupt systems serves neither justice nor genuine human flourishing. The cost would be high, paid in lost relationships and social stigma and years of legal complexity. But silence would have cost me something more precious: my integrity, my self-respect, and my ability to model for my children that principles sometimes require sacrifice. I collected my evidence files and my identification and drove toward the confrontation that would change everything. The evening was beautiful in the way autumn evenings often are in the Northeast, the air crisp and clear, the sky deepening from blue to purple as twilight approached. I felt simultaneously terrified and calm, anxious about specific details while certain about the fundamental rightness of what I was preparing to do. The Ashford Grand Hotel appeared on the horizon, its illuminated facade promising luxury and celebration to the guests arriving for Meridian's charity gala. But I was not attending to celebrate. I was attending to expose, to confront, to demand accountability from people who had convinced themselves that their sophistication and success placed them above the moral obligations that constrained ordinary people. Marcus and Vanessa had built their affair and their fraud on the assumption that comfortable wives and trusting investors would never seriously challenge their authority or question their integrity. They had mistaken passivity for weakness and patience for blindness. Tonight they would learn the difference between tolerance and complicity, between strategic silence and genuine ignorance. I parked my modest sedan among the luxury vehicles and walked toward the hotel entrance, carrying evidence of systematic fraud and the courage born of righteous anger. The confrontation ahead would be difficult and painful, and potentially devastating in ways I could not fully anticipate. But it would also be honest, a refusal to participate further in deception that had consumed too much of my life already. The time for comfortable silence had ended. The moment for uncomfortable truth had arrived. And I walked forward to meet it with determination forged through betrayal and tempered by the recognition that justice sometimes requires sacrifice from those who demand it most insistently. The drive home from the Ashford Grand Hotel occurred in a state of heightened awareness that bordered on surreal detachment. Every traffic light seemed impossibly bright, each street sign crystalline in its clarity, the familiar route transformed into foreign territory by the magnitude of what had just transpired. My hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, knuckles white against the dark leather, as if physical tension could anchor me against the emotional turbulence threatening to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. The gala had ended exactly as I had orchestrated, with Marcus and Vanessa in federal custody facing charges that would likely result in substantial prison sentences. The 200 guests who had gathered to celebrate Meridian's success had instead witnessed the spectacular collapse of carefully constructed lies, their evening of luxury interrupted by the harsh intrusion of criminal justice. Special Agent Torres and her team had executed the arrests with professional efficiency, reading Miranda rights in voices that carried clearly through the shocked silence of the ballroom, while hotel security ensured that exits remained accessible but monitored. I had left immediately after providing my statement, declining offers from several investors to discuss my investigation in greater detail. Catherine Murdoch had pressed her business card into my hand with whispered assurances that her firm would support any testimony I could provide in civil litigation aimed at recovering stolen funds. A journalist from a major financial publication had approached me in the lobby, asking if I would consent to an interview about how I had uncovered the fraud. I had refused all of these requests politely but firmly, explaining that I needed to return home to my children, and that any further statements would need to wait until I had consulted with legal counsel about appropriate boundaries for public discussion. The truth was that I felt completely unprepared for the attention that would inevitably follow from my role in exposing Marcus and Vanessa's crimes. I had focused so intensely on gathering evidence and planning the confrontation that I had given insufficient thought to what would happen afterward, to how my life would change once the arrests became public knowledge and media outlets began reporting on the scandal. Within hours, my name would be associated with financial fraud and marital betrayal, my privacy invaded by reporters seeking details about my marriage and my investigation. My children would wake tomorrow to discover that their father had been arrested, and that their mother was responsible for his incarceration. The babysitter was reading on the couch when I arrived home, her expression shifting to concern when she saw me enter several hours earlier than anticipated. Jessica was a responsible college student who had been watching Sophia and Daniel for the past 2 years, reliable and trustworthy in ways that had made her invaluable during the investigation period, when I needed someone who would not ask uncomfortable questions about my absences and preoccupation. "Mrs. Chun, is everything all right?" Jessica asked, setting aside her textbook and standing with the instinctive courtesy of young people who have been taught to respect their elders. "I wasn't expecting you back until after midnight." I manufactured a smile that probably appeared more strained than reassuring. "The event ended early. How were the children? Any problems with bedtime?" Jessica shook her head, gathering her belongings while providing the standard report that parents received from capable babysitters. Sophia had completed her homework and read for 30 minutes before lights out at 9 o'clock. Daniel had resisted bedtime with his usual creative excuses, but had eventually settled down after being allowed to finish one more chapter of his current book. Both children were sleeping soundly when Jessica had checked on them 15 minutes ago. I paid Jessica her usual rate plus a generous tip that reflected my gratitude for her consistent reliability during a period when I had desperately needed someone I could trust to care for my children, while I pursued an investigation that felt simultaneously necessary and potentially destructive. She accepted the money with thanks and departed into the autumn night, leaving me alone in the house that had been my home for 8 years but now felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. The silence was profound and disorienting. For months I had lived with constant tension, the background hum of anxiety that accompanied my dual existence as suburban mother and forensic investigator, building a criminal case against my husband. That tension had reached its crescendo at the gala, the dramatic confrontation releasing pressure that had been building for weeks. Now, in the aftermath, I felt hollowed out and uncertain, as if the determination that had sustained me through the investigation had been fuel that burned completely during the confrontation, leaving nothing behind but exhaustion and dawning realization of the enormity of what I had set in motion. I climbed the stairs to check on Sophia and Daniel, standing in their doorways and watching them sleep with the fierce protective love that parenthood engenders regardless of circumstances. They looked peaceful and innocent, temporarily shielded by sleep from the knowledge that would devastate them when morning arrived. Sophia's dark hair spread across her pillow, her features relaxed in ways they rarely were during waking hours when she carried the particular seriousness of oldest children who feel responsible for maintaining family harmony. Daniel slept in his characteristic sprawl, blankets kicked aside despite the autumn chill, his face still carrying the roundness of childhood that had not yet given way to the sharper angles of adolescence. How would I explain to them that their father was in federal detention, that he had committed crimes that would send him to prison for years, that their comfortable life had been built partially on money stolen from investors who trusted Meridian's reputation, that I had been the person who gathered evidence and triggered the prosecution that would tear their family apart? The letter I had written earlier remained sealed on my desk, my attempt to provide explanation and reassurance in language that children could understand without being overwhelmed by the full complexity of adult failures and consequences. But letters felt inadequate for conversations that needed to occur face to face, with the opportunity for questions and emotional processing that written words could not facilitate. I would need to speak with them in the morning, to tell them as much truth as they could handle while protecting them from details that would serve no purpose beyond inflicting additional pain. I retreated to my bedroom, the space I had shared with Marcus for years, but which now felt contaminated by his betrayal and absence. The bed seemed impossibly large without his presence, though that presence had been largely performative for months as he divided his attention between maintaining domestic appearances and conducting his affair with Vanessa. I sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing my navy dress from the gala, and allowed myself for the first time since discovering the burner phone to fully experience the grief that I had been suppressing through months of investigation and preparation. The tears came suddenly and forcefully, months of accumulated sorrow and rage and betrayal finding release in sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the marriage I thought I had built, for the partnership that had never actually existed except in my naive imagination. I cried for my children, who would suffer consequences of their father's choices despite bearing no responsibility for his crimes. I cried for the version of myself that had believed sacrifice and devotion would be reciprocated rather than exploited, who had trusted that building a life together meant actual collaboration, rather than my unilateral subordination to someone else's ambitions. But I also cried with something that felt distantly like relief, the cathartic release of finally acknowledging truth that I had been avoiding or minimizing for years. Marcus had not transformed suddenly into someone capable of fraud and infidelity. The capacity had always existed within him, visible in smaller betrayals and casual cruelties that I had excused or rationalized because confronting them would have required acknowledging that I had misjudged the person I married. The affair with Vanessa and the systematic theft from Meridian investors were simply the logical extensions of character flaws that had been present all along, growing more pronounced as Marcus gained power and resources that enabled acting on impulses he might have suppressed under conditions of greater constraint. I had not caused his criminality by becoming too comfortable or insufficiently sophisticated. I had simply provided him with stable domestic foundation that freed him to pursue professional advancement, without concern for household management or childcare responsibilities. He had used that freedom not to build something honorable and sustainable, but rather to construct elaborate fraud while pursuing an affair with someone he perceived as more worthy of his evolved status and refined tastes. The recognition was painful but also liberating. I could release the self-blame that had plagued me during the investigation, the persistent whisper that perhaps I had driven Marcus to betrayal through my own failures and inadequacies. His choices were his own, motivated by greed and arrogance rather than by any deficiency in my character or contributions to our marriage. I had been a good wife and partner, faithful and supportive and willing to sacrifice personal ambitions for family well-being. That Marcus had responded to those qualities with contempt and exploitation reflected his moral failures rather than my inadequacies. Sleep came eventually despite emotional turbulence, exhaustion overriding anxiety and grief to pull me into unconsciousness that provided temporary escape from the reality waiting when morning arrived. I dreamed in fragments, disjointed images of the gala and the investigation and memories from earlier in my marriage, when I still believed that Marcus and I were building something genuine and lasting. The dreams carried the particular emotional intensity that accompanies major life disruptions, my subconscious processing what my conscious mind had been too focused on practical necessities to fully absorb. I woke to pale dawn light filtering through bedroom curtains, and the immediate recognition that everything had changed irrevocably. The house remained quiet, Sophia and Daniel still sleeping, unaware that their father had spent the night in federal detention, rather than at the charity gala he had been so excited to attend. I rose and showered mechanically, dressing in comfortable clothes that felt appropriate for difficult conversations rather than professional presentation. Today would not be about maintaining appearances or projecting competence. Today would be about honesty and emotional support, and beginning the long process of helping my children understand and cope with their family's dissolution. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, the accumulation of overnight attempts by various parties to reach me for comment or clarification or support. Several messages came from friends and acquaintances who had apparently learned about Marcus's arrest through media reports or social networks, their texts ranging from shocked disbelief to offers of assistance to barely concealed curiosity about details. I ignored all of them, recognizing that I lacked emotional bandwidth to manage other people's reactions to my personal catastrophe, while still grappling with my own processing and preparing to support my children through theirs. One message stood out from the others, sent by Special Agent Torres at 3 o'clock in the morning. The text was brief and professional, informing me that Marcus and Vanessa had been formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Both had been denied bail given flight risk concerns and the substantial assets they had transferred to offshore accounts. Initial court appearances were scheduled for later today, and federal prosecutors wanted to meet with me within the next 48 hours to discuss my testimony and review additional evidence that might strengthen their case. The message concluded with something unexpected, a personal note that suggested Agent Torres recognized the human dimension of what I was experiencing beyond my role as witness and evidence source. She wrote that she had worked with many whistleblowers and fraud victims over her 20-year career, and she considered what I had done to be extraordinarily courageous given the personal costs involved. She reminded me that victim assistance resources were available through the FBI, and provided contact information for counselors who specialized in supporting individuals who had been betrayed by intimate partners or family members. The kindness implicit in that message threatened to trigger another wave of tears, but I forced myself to remain composed. My children would be waking soon, and they needed me to be strong and steady rather than visibly falling apart. There would be time later for my own emotional processing. Right now, I needed to prioritize their well-being and help them navigate the immediate crisis before addressing my own grief and trauma. Sophia emerged from her bedroom first, appearing in the kitchen doorway with tousled hair and sleepy eyes that sharpened into alertness when she registered something unusual in my expression or posture. She was perceptive in ways that sometimes felt almost eerie, her emotional intelligence highly developed for someone her age, a quality that would serve her well in adulthood but which now meant she would grasp the seriousness of what I needed to tell her more quickly than I might have preferred. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked immediately, moving toward me with concern that made my heart ache with love and sorrow. "Where's Dad? Did something happen?" I guided her to sit at the kitchen table, taking the chair beside her and reaching for her hand with the instinctive need for physical connection during difficult conversations. "Something very serious has happened, and I need to explain it to you as honestly as I can. Your father is not home because he was arrested last night at the charity gala he was attending. He has been charged with financial crimes related to his work at Meridian Properties." Sophia's face went pale, her hand tightening around mine with almost painful pressure. "Arrested? Like with police in jail? That doesn't make sense. Dad's not a criminal. There must be some mistake." The denial was natural and expected, the initial defense mechanism that minds employ when confronted with information that contradicts fundamental beliefs about people we love and trust. I had experienced similar denial when I first discovered the burner phone, the desperate hope that some innocent explanation existed for what appeared to be damning evidence. But denial could not be sustained indefinitely in the face of overwhelming proof, and Sophia would need to move through it toward acceptance relatively quickly given the public nature of Marcus's crimes and arrest. "I understand this is shocking and difficult to believe," I said gently, maintaining eye contact despite wanting to look away from her pain. "But the evidence is very clear. Your father has been stealing money from Meridian's investors through a scheme involving fake construction costs and hidden accounts. He did this together with his boss, Vanessa Whitmore, over a period of more than a year. I discovered what they were doing several weeks ago, while investigating some financial irregularities I noticed. I gathered evidence and provided it to federal investigators, which led to their arrests last night." Sophia processed this information with visible effort, her expression cycling through disbelief and confusion and dawning comprehension. "You mean you knew? You knew Dad was doing illegal things and you didn't tell him you found out? You just investigated him like he was some stranger instead of your husband?" The question contained implicit accusation, the suggestion that perhaps I bore responsibility for the family's destruction by choosing investigation over confrontation, evidence gathering over marital communication. It was a natural response from a child trying to make sense of how her family had splintered so suddenly and completely. But it also reflected fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of Marcus's crimes, and the impossibility of addressing systematic fraud through private conversation. "I did what I had to do to protect other people from being hurt by your father's crimes," I explained, keeping my voice steady despite the emotional weight of having to justify my actions to my daughter. "If I had confronted your father privately, he would have had the opportunity to destroy evidence and potentially escape prosecution. Other people, investors who trusted Meridian with their money, would have lost everything while your father and Vanessa disappeared with millions of dollars. I could not allow that to happen just because exposing the truth would be painful for our family." Sophia pulled her hand away from mine, her expression hardening in ways that suggested she was erecting emotional barriers against pain too overwhelming to fully absorb. "So you chose strangers over your own family. You chose to put Dad in jail instead of trying to help him or give him a chance to fix whatever mistakes he made." The interpretation stung precisely because it contained enough truth to make simple denial impossible. I had indeed prioritized justice for fraud victims over protecting my husband from consequences of his criminal behavior. I had chosen principle over family loyalty in ways that would result in Sophia and Daniel growing up without their father present during their formative years. Those choices had been necessary and right given the circumstances, but they were also genuinely costly for people who bore no responsibility for Marcus's crimes, yet would suffer significant consequences nonetheless. Your father made choices that hurt many people, including our family, I said firmly, refusing to accept blame for consequences that flowed from Marcus's decisions, rather than from my response to discovering those decisions. He chose to steal money. He chose to lie to his colleagues and investors. He chose to betray the trust that people placed in him. I did not make those choices. I simply refused to help him hide them or escape accountability for them. That was the right thing to do, even though it creates enormous pain and disruption for you and Daniel and me. Daniel appeared in the doorway before Sophia could respond, his presence shifting the dynamic and requiring me to explain the situation again in language appropriate for an 8-year-old who possessed less capacity for understanding complex adult failures and their consequences. He looked between Sophia and me with growing anxiety, clearly sensing tension and upset without comprehending their source. "Why does Sophia look like she's about to cry?" he asked with the direct simplicity of young children who have not yet learned to avoid uncomfortable questions. "And where's Dad? He usually makes pancakes on Saturday mornings." I extended my other hand toward Daniel, inviting him to join us at the table, while mentally preparing to deliver news that would fundamentally alter his understanding of his father and his family. "Come sit down, sweetheart. I need to tell you something important and difficult. Your father is not home this morning because he was arrested last night for breaking laws related to his work. He is currently in jail while authorities figure out what will happen next." Daniel's face crumpled with incomprehension and distress. At 8 years old, his concept of crime and punishment derived largely from simplified narratives about clear villains and heroes, rather than the morally complex reality where beloved parents could simultaneously be caring fathers and systematic criminals. "But Dad's not bad," he protested, tears beginning to stream down his cheeks. "Bad people go to jail. Dad helps people and goes to work and plays catch with me. He can't be in jail." The conversation continued for more than an hour, a painful process of explaining and answering questions, and providing reassurance that proved inadequate against the magnitude of changes our family faced. I tried to balance honesty with age-appropriate shielding, telling them enough truth that they would not feel betrayed when they inevitably learned more details, but protecting them from specific information about Marcus's affair with Vanessa or the full extent of his theft and deception. They needed to understand that their father had made serious mistakes that carried serious consequences, but they did not need graphic details that would serve no purpose beyond making an already traumatic situation even more psychologically damaging. Sophia's anger toward me persisted throughout the conversation, her loyalty to Marcus manifesting as resentment toward the person who had exposed his crimes rather than anger at the person who had committed them. This response was developmentally normal for a child her age, a way of preserving her attachment to her father by displacing negative emotions onto a safer target who would not abandon her regardless of how she expressed her pain. I absorbed her anger without defending myself aggressively, recognizing that she needed time and probably professional therapeutic support to process her feelings and eventually arrive at more nuanced understanding of the situation. Daniel's response was more straightforwardly sorrowful, less interested in assigning blame than simply grieving the loss of his father's daily presence and the disruption to family routines that had provided structure and security. He asked repeatedly when Marcus would come home, struggling to understand that the answer might be measured in years rather than days or weeks. I held him while he cried, offering physical comfort when words proved insufficient for addressing his distress. By mid-morning, when both children had exhausted their immediate capacity for processing traumatic information, I settled them in the living room with activities that might provide temporary distraction, while I began addressing the practical necessities that accompanied family crisis. I needed to contact a divorce attorney to discuss how to protect whatever assets remained accessible given that Marcus had transferred substantial amounts to offshore accounts during his fraud. I needed to speak with federal prosecutors about my testimony and the timeline for criminal proceedings. I needed to inform Sophia and Daniel's schools about the family situation so teachers could provide appropriate support and monitoring. I needed to manage my own emotional state well enough to remain functional despite feeling shattered and overwhelmed. The doorbell rang shortly after 11 o'clock, an unexpected interruption that filled me with immediate anxiety about who might be seeking access to my home and family during such a vulnerable period. I checked the security camera and saw Catherine Murdoch standing on my front porch, holding a bakery box and wearing an expression of genuine concern rather than the intrusive curiosity I had feared from journalists or acquaintances seeking gossip disguised as support. I opened the door cautiously, uncertain what Catherine wanted but grateful that at least she represented someone with legitimate professional interest in the case rather than mere prurient fascination with scandal. "Catherine, I was not expecting you. How did you get my address?" She offered a small apologetic smile. "I hope you don't mind. I asked Rebecca Torres for your contact information and explained that I wanted to check on you personally, rather than simply scheduling a formal deposition. I brought coffee and pastries if you would like some company, but I will leave immediately if you would prefer to be alone with your family right now." The gesture of practical kindness threatened to overwhelm my fragile composure. I had been braced for judgment and invasion but unprepared for genuine compassion from someone who had witnessed my public exposure of Marcus and understood both the courage required and the cost extracted. I stepped aside to allow Catherine entry, accepting the bakery box and leading her toward the kitchen where we could speak without disturbing Sophia and Daniel. Catherine settled into a chair at the kitchen table, while I prepared coffee with automatic movements that required minimal conscious thought. She waited patiently until I sat across from her before speaking, her voice gentle but direct in the manner of someone who understood that excessive delicacy sometimes felt more patronizing than supportive. "What you did last night took extraordinary courage," she said simply. "I have worked in financial services for 30 years and encountered numerous instances of fraud and corruption. Most people who discover wrongdoing by family members or close associates choose to look away rather than expose themselves to the personal costs that come with whistleblowing. You made a different choice, one that demonstrates remarkable integrity and strength. I wanted you to know that you have allies who recognize and appreciate what you sacrifice to bring truth to light." The validation landed with unexpected emotional force, tears I had been suppressing throughout the morning finally breaking through my defenses. Catherine reached across the table to squeeze my hand, offering silent support while I cried with the particular intensity that comes from finally feeling safe enough to release emotions that circumstances have required suppressing. When I regained some measure of composure, Catherine continued with practical matters that required attention despite emotional turmoil. Her investment firm would be pursuing civil litigation against Marcus, Vanessa, and Meridian to recover stolen funds and compensate investors for losses. They would need detailed testimony from me about my investigation and the evidence I had gathered. They would also provide resources to support me through the legal process, including covering costs for legal representation to protect my interests during both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts. "You should not have to bear financial burden for doing the right thing," Catherine explained. "My firm and several other major investors have agreed to establish a fund that will ensure you have access to excellent legal counsel throughout the proceedings. We will also work to protect whatever marital assets remain uncontaminated by Marcus's fraud, though I suspect that recovery will be complicated given how thoroughly he and Vanessa structured their theft through offshore accounts and shell companies." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering practical logistics and emotional support in equal measure. Catherine shared that media interest in the case was already substantial, with multiple business publications and mainstream news outlets requesting interviews and background information. She advised me to hire a public relations consultant who specialized in crisis communication, someone who could help me manage media requests and control my narrative, rather than allowing others to construct potentially damaging interpretations of my actions and motivations. She also emphasized the importance of securing therapeutic support for Sophia and Daniel, recommending a child psychologist who specialized in helping children cope with parental incarceration and family dissolution. The psychologist had experience working with families affected by white-collar crime, understanding the particular challenges that accompanied the intersection of betrayal, public scandal, and criminal justice involvement. By the time Catherine departed, I felt marginally more equipped to navigate the complex aftermath of my decision to expose Marcus and Vanessa's fraud. The road ahead remained difficult and uncertain, filled with legal proceedings and media scrutiny, and ongoing emotional processing for myself and my children. But I was not facing those challenges entirely alone, supported by people like Catherine who recognized courage when they witnessed it, and chose to offer practical assistance rather than mere sympathy. The rest of Saturday passed in a blur of phone calls and research and attempts to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Sophia and Daniel despite the fundamental disruption to their lives. I ordered pizza for dinner rather than cooking, too exhausted to manage anything more demanding than opening a delivery box. We ate together in front of the television, watching animated movies that provided temporary escape from reality, while allowing us to simply be together as a reduced but still intact family unit. That night, after both children had finally fallen asleep following hours of anxious wakefulness and repeated requests for reassurance, I sat alone in my home office surrounded by the evidence files that had been instruments of both justice and family destruction. The documentation remained as compelling as when I had first compiled it, proof of systematic fraud that could not be explained away or attributed to innocent misunderstanding. I had been right to expose Marcus's crimes, right to refuse complicity through silence, right to prioritize truth over comfortable lies. But being right provided no protection against pain, no immunity from grief and doubt, and the terrible weight of consequences that extended far beyond the guilty parties to encompass innocent children, who deserved better than parents who had failed them through criminality, and through the necessity of exposing that criminality. Justice and wisdom did not always align neatly, and doing what was right sometimes required accepting that you would be forever marked by decisions that others would judge from the safety of less complicated moral circumstances. I powered down my computer and turned off the office lights, closing the door on that chapter of investigation and confrontation, while acknowledging that the story was far from complete. Criminal prosecution would unfold over months or years. Civil litigation would continue indefinitely as investors sought to recover losses from depleted accounts and dissolved entities. Media coverage would periodically resurface the scandal as new developments emerged or anniversaries prompted retrospective analysis. Through all of that, I would need to rebuild a life for myself and my children while processing my own trauma and supporting them through theirs. I would need to return to professional work to support us financially given that Marcus's assets would likely be seized for victim restitution. I would need to explain repeatedly to friends and acquaintances and eventually to romantic partners why my marriage had ended in federal prosecution, and whether they should question my judgment for having failed to recognize my husband's character flaws before investing 12 years in a relationship with him. These challenges felt overwhelming in their accumulation, a mountain of difficulty that seemed impossible to scale from the position of exhausted vulnerability where I currently stood. But I had also learned through the investigation that mountains could be climbed through patient persistence, one step at a time, maintaining focus on immediate necessities while trusting that sustained effort would eventually produce meaningful progress toward distant summits. Tonight I would rest. Tomorrow I would begin the long climb toward recovery and reconstruction. And somewhere in that future, perhaps I would discover that the comfortable life I had lost had been traded for something more valuable. Authenticity, integrity, and the self-respect that comes from refusing to participate in beautiful lies, even when truth promises only difficult consequences. The Sunday morning newspapers transformed my private catastrophe into public spectacle, splashing the Meridian fraud across front pages with headlines that reduced months of investigation and years of betrayal into digestible sound bites designed to capture attention during brief commutes and coffee breaks. The coverage ranged from respectful business journalism, analyzing the mechanics of the fraud, to sensationalized tabloid reporting that focused on the affair between Marcus and Vanessa, with prurient emphasis on personal drama over financial crime. I discovered the extent of media coverage when my phone began receiving notifications with such frequency that the device vibrated almost continuously. Dozens of news alerts and social media mentions arriving faster than I could process or dismiss them. Against my better judgment, I opened several articles to assess how journalists were framing the story, and what information had entered public circulation beyond what I had directly provided through my statement at the gala. The New York Times ran a measured piece under the headline "Luxury Real Estate Executive Arrested in Multimillion-Dollar Fraud Scheme." The article detailed the charges against Marcus and Vanessa with appropriate journalistic distance, describing the inflation of construction costs and the diversion of investor funds through shell companies. My role received mention as the whistleblower who had conducted the investigation and provided evidence to federal authorities, though the reporter had exercised restraint in exploring personal dimensions of the case beyond noting that I was Marcus's wife and had discovered the fraud while examining family financial records. The Wall Street Journal took a similar approach, emphasizing the business implications and investor losses while treating my involvement as secondary to the larger story about fraud in luxury real estate development. Their coverage included interviews with several Meridian investors who expressed shock at the revelations and gratitude that the scheme had been exposed before losses became even more catastrophic. Catherine Murdoch was quoted extensively, praising the thoroughness of my investigation, while calling for increased regulatory oversight of large-scale development projects, where complex financial structures created opportunities for sophisticated theft. The tabloid coverage proved far less restrained, with headlines that made me physically recoil from their invasive sensationalism. The New York Post ran with "Suburban Mom Brings Down Cheating Husband's Real Estate Empire," accompanied by photographs of Marcus and Vanessa from previous charity events, alongside a dated picture of me from some forgotten social occasion where I appeared tired and unremarkable. The article dwelled extensively on the affair, quoting unnamed sources who claimed to have observed Marcus and Vanessa's relationship over the past year, and who provided lurid details about their romantic involvement that added nothing to understanding the fraud but satisfied reader appetite for scandal. Several outlets had somehow obtained photographs from the gala itself, capturing the moment when I stood on stage making my accusations while Vanessa's face registered shock and dawning horror. These images circulated rapidly across social media platforms, accompanied by commentary that ranged from admiration for my courage to criticism of my methods to crude jokes about marital dynamics and revenge. I became briefly viral, my actions debated by thousands of strangers who felt entitled to judge decisions they had not faced from positions of safety and comfort. The social media discourse proved particularly difficult to witness, though I recognized that reading it served no constructive purpose and should be avoided for the sake of my mental health. Twitter users engaged in heated arguments about whether I had acted heroically or vindicatively, whether I should have confronted Marcus privately before involving authorities, whether exposing a spouse's crimes constituted betrayal or obligation. The debate divided largely along gender lines, with women more likely to express support for my actions, while men more frequently questioned my motives and methods. One thread that gained substantial traction involved speculation about what kind of wife drives her husband to fraud and infidelity, the implication being that I bore responsibility for Marcus's crimes through some failure of feminine appeal or domestic adequacy. The comments were vicious in their casual cruelty, strangers who knew nothing about my marriage or my character making definitive pronouncements about my inadequacies based on nothing more than their own prejudices about gender roles and marital obligations. I forced myself to stop reading after encountering multiple assertions that I had probably been a cold and neglectful wife who pushed Marcus into Vanessa's arms through my own shortcomings. The contrast between respectful journalism and vicious social media commentary illustrated something fundamental about how truth gets processed and distorted in contemporary information ecosystems. Responsible reporters with editorial oversight maintain professional standards and factual accuracy, treating me as a source and witness, rather than as entertainment or cautionary tale. But those standards dissolved completely in unmoderated digital spaces where anonymity enabled cruelty, and algorithmic amplification rewarded emotional provocation over thoughtful analysis. I needed to protect Sophia and Daniel from exposure to the worst of this coverage, particularly the social media discourse that reduced their family trauma to fodder for strangers' entertainment and moral grandstanding. Both children were old enough to use computers and phones with relative independence, which meant they could easily encounter disturbing content if I did not establish clear boundaries and monitoring. I gathered them in the living room Sunday afternoon for a conversation about media literacy and emotional protection. You have probably noticed that your father's arrest is being reported in newspapers and online. I began, choosing words carefully to acknowledge reality without overwhelming them with its full harshness. A lot of people are writing and talking about what happened because financial crimes involving large amounts of money attract public attention. Some of this coverage is accurate and respectful, but some of it is sensationalized and hurtful. I need you both to understand that reading or watching this coverage will probably upset you and will not help you process what our family is going through. Sophia's expression suggested she had already been searching for information online despite my earlier warnings to avoid media coverage. People are saying terrible things about you, she said quietly. Her earlier anger toward me apparently softening into something more protective. I read comments saying you destroyed our family just to get revenge on Dad for his affair. They are calling you names and saying you are a bad wife and mother. The knowledge that my daughter had been exposed to strangers' vicious judgments of my character and choices felt like a physical blow. I moved to sit beside her on the couch, putting my arm around her shoulders despite her initial stiffness. People who do not know us or understand the full situation often say cruel things, especially when they can do so anonymously without accountability. Their opinions are not based on facts or genuine insight into what happened. They are simply projecting their own beliefs and biases onto a situation they know almost nothing about. Daniel looked between Sophia and me with confusion that suggested he had not yet encountered the worst of the social media discourse and did not fully understand what we were discussing. His innocence in this regard felt precious and worth protecting for as long as possible, though I recognized that children at his school would likely hear about the scandal from parents or older siblings and might repeat information without understanding its impact. I want you both to promise me that you will not search for news coverage about your father's arrest or our family situation, I continued, making direct eye contact with each of them to emphasize the seriousness of my request. If people at school or in other contexts say things to you about what happened, I want you to tell me immediately so we can talk about it together. But actively seeking out information online will expose you to content that is designed to attract attention through sensationalism, rather than to inform through accuracy. That kind of content will hurt you without helping you understand anything important. Sophia nodded reluctantly, though her expression suggested she might struggle to follow through on the promise given her natural curiosity and desire to understand what people were saying about her family. I would need to implement parental controls on devices and monitor her online activity more closely than I had previously considered necessary. A practical response to protect her from psychological harm, even if it felt like invasion of privacy under normal circumstances. The rest of Sunday passed in relative quiet as we attempted to establish some semblance of routine despite the fundamental disruption to our lives. I prepared simple meals and encouraged the children to engage with homework and recreational activities that might provide temporary distraction from anxiety and grief. We avoided discussing Marcus or the arrest unless one of them raised questions, allowing them to process at their own pace rather than forcing conversations they were not ready to have. My own emotional state remained precarious, oscillating between determination to move forward productively and overwhelming grief about everything I had lost. The marriage had been dying long before I discovered Marcus's crimes, poisoned by his growing contempt and my diminishing sense of self-worth. But losing even a troubled marriage still constituted genuine loss. The death of hopes and dreams I had carried for years despite accumulating evidence that they would never be realized. I mourned not what Marcus and I actually had together, but what I had believed we were building before reality intruded with undeniable proof of his betrayal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.